We started to get into ethics and
business ethics and advertising.
Okay, we talked a little bit about business ethics advertising. Talked about the way that they disseminate information. And basically, if you think about it for just a moment, you've got a media who is answering to a lot of different people. They are answering to their ultimate boss who owns the company. They're answering to the public, to the government, to all these different things. And we talked about how, in many occasions, media does not necessarily portray the truth. Sometimes there's other things involved, such as money and ratings and things like that. I want us to start with a question that I really had kind of hoped we would get to at the end of last class because it tied in better. But we're going to go ahead and start with it today. Let me switch over here. What about your role as a preacher, a disseminator of information? As you think about all the stuff that we talked about from a media perspective, are you, in effect, training yourself to be basically a particular kind of newscaster or news reporter? What do you think?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. How much should a preacher embellish or story tell?
embellish, not at all.
Yeah. Let me rephrase that. Do preachers embellish or story tell?
Yes, they do.
Okay. Now, here's the point I'm trying to make, and I realize it's been a couple of days since we were last together, so the connection may not come through as clearly. We talked about and we harped on the fact that the media, oftentimes they tell the stories they want to tell. They kind of come at it from a slant that they want to come at it. What do you think is the distinguishing differences between a newscaster and a preacher?
The preacher is dealing with people's eternal salvation.
Okay.
You mean if
Is that all?
No.
I mean, is that the only difference? Is basically the quality of what we're discussing?
Well, hopefully we're telling everything in all honesty.
Preachers
I think agenda.
All right, so let's think about this for just a minute, guys. Every single one of you sitting in there, every single one of you has heard, whether you freely admit it or not, you've heard preachers use scriptures out of context to fit their message. You know, they grab something that sounds good and or kind of side to that, maybe rather than grabbing a verse out of context, they just grab a piece that you know deep down doesn't necessarily support what they're saying, but they kind of cherry pick a verse, plug it in to make everything sound very smooth and like they've got the truth on their side.
That's lying.
Is that not as bad as what we condemned the news media for last week?
It's worse.
It's worse.
Yeah, because ultimately, as somebody said, we're dealing in people's souls here. So how do you guys, as preaching students, set up an ethical guideline for yourself to make sure that you don't start following into this?
Preach the word and the word only, and don't try to make it say something that you want it to say or it's not saying.
Okay, give me an example, KJ, of somebody making it say something that they might want it to say.
Like, basically anything, really. We're studying the book of John with Dan Owens.
Yeah.
And in chapters 14 through 17, he's talking to his disciples only. But, like, on several occasions, he says, I will be with you and I will teach you all things, via the Holy Spirit. And people like to apply that to themselves today. And preachers like to, not necessarily Church of Christ preachers or anything like that, but, that's somewhere where they can take Jesus' word out of context and make it apply to us instead of applying to only the apostles.
Okay. What are some things though that you guys can do as individuals to kind of self-check and make sure, because out of a class this big, we'll say there's 12 of you in there, the chances are pretty good that at least one or two of you are going to get caught up in the moment on several occasions when you're preaching, and you're going to end up either embellishing something, maybe completely fabricating something, in order to make your case better, to sound better, to get the warm fuzzies from the little old ladies. How can you guard against that?
I think our knowledge. Oh, sorry.
Well, by like studying, the Bible and what we're actually going to be using for the text a lot better, so we don't use scriptures out of context.
Okay. That's a key thing, guys. You know how many preachers? Let's take a topic for a second. Let's say that I'm preaching a sermon on elders and leadership. And so basically, I'm pushed for time, I grab my concordance, I open it up, and I pull all the verses that have the words elders in it. And even if it doesn't mean elder as in a shepherd, I go ahead and use that in my particular sermon. I pad stories around both sides of the scripture to kind of make it sound better. Boom, I'm ready to preach in my sermon. Even though, realistically, some of the stuff that I'm using in there shouldn't be. Somebody else, KJ, you had a comment.
I think we got to remember why we're preaching. We're not preaching to entice the warm fuzzies from people. We're preaching so that they'll understand the Word of God and understand it more perfectly. And if when we start preaching based on emotions of the crowd, that we're headed down a very slippery slope.
But, guys, listen to me carefully before I call on Chris and John. There are men who are sitting in the same seat you've been sitting in, who have basically gone up the ranks, have done extremely well in being public speakers, and have fallen for the praises of men. They're real. There are a lot of preachers out there who are now basically embracing things that they shouldn't be embracing, and the whole reason that they're embracing them is because they know, hey, if I do this, I'm going to have people that follow me, the church is going to be bigger, and basically it's a big, huge ego trip, all built on what they think is okay, but it's simply storytelling, it's cherry-picking the scriptures and doing things the way that they want to. John, you got a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say we should do all we can to prepare our lessons properly to where we're not at the last minute just grabbing a concordance and whipping out a word here and there. That shows, even though you may be able to pull it off a few times, ultimately it shows your lack of care for the people that you're being entrusted. God has given you the job to move people based on His Word, not on your abilities.
And guys, you've all probably been sitting in a congregation where you've seen somebody do that, where they've taken a topic, whatever the topic may be. Let's say it's on grace or on whatever, and you can literally in their sermon, you can just follow them going through Strong's Concordance, starting in the Old Testament, working through the New Testament, and all they're doing basically is picking those verses that have grace in it, reading it, trying to tie it into a central message, when realistically they pulled some of those really horribly out of context. Chuck, you had a comment?
Looking at James 3:1 and just that whole chapter telling us, whenever we preach or whenever we're teaching, we're not only putting the Word of God into people's mouths, but it's directing their whole body. And as preachers, we need to realize that it's not just words that we're speaking, but like someone says, it's about people's souls. But people are going to hang on to those words, and then they're going to go and teach others.
Yep.
And if they're teaching others falsely because we have an agenda or we have something that we think is right, then that's more souls that are going to be counted against us. The wood hanging straw that's going to be burnt up.
Absolutely. I mean, teachers and preachers, according to Scripture, are held to a higher standard. And, you know, I think it's very wrong for us to sit in an ethics class and condemn the news media and the advertising industry and say, you know, these guys are doing horrible things, and then we basically kind of let things slide when it comes into a church building, because we know brother so-and-so, and we know he means good, and he's just trying to make his point. Okay, well, yeah, he may be meaning good, and he may just be trying to make a point, but if he is not teaching and preaching the truth, how much are we willing to let slide? Chris, you got a comment?
I think accountability is a big part of it. We, as preachers, are no different than any other Christian, in that we need to be held accountable for the things that we do and say. Actually, we're to be held even more accountable. We have to be willing to find those people and to ask people to hold us accountable. Our family members, our elders, members of the congregations that we preach for. And there's something very humbling about knowing that the things that I do and I say, people are watching them, and not just because they're going to just blindly follow me, but because they want to help keep me humble.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I think all of you guys need to determine within yourselves now that, ethically speaking, whatever presents itself during your tenure as a preacher, that you're going to take the right road. Because you need to understand, every single one of you, if you haven't already been put in an ethical quandary, you will be. And I mean, that's just flat out telling you like it is. There's going to be a situation where maybe an eldership wants to treat one family different than another. There may be a situation where somebody is doing something at the congregation. Maybe they're cheating the congregation on time. Like you've got a member who works as a janitor, and you know that member keeps basically abusing the leniency that the congregation has given them as far as coming and going at their own will, and they're only putting in 20 hours when they're billing the church for 40. Or maybe there's somebody that's doing the books for the church and may not be embezzling or doing anything illegal in that aspect, but maybe the person just doesn't have the time, and he looks at it as, well, you know, it's just a church anyway, and kind of bumps down the level of service, which is actually overlooking any of the accounting practices of the church. I mean, eventually you're going to run into something, and as you're sitting here right now, you know, in a class, it's very easy to say, I'm going to take the high road and we're going to do this. My point is, you need to already have decided in your minds, no matter what hits you, and there will be some things that hit you, that you're going to take the scrutiny. You may take a job loss. You may have to move your family in the middle of the week sometime, but you're going to stand for something that you know is right. Dustin, you got to come in.
Yeah. Does this include, like, for illustration, like giving hypothetical stories?
Well, that's why I'm talking about embellishing. Because there again, how many preachers actually check the sources for these alleged hypothetical stories?
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Now, I don't have a problem if somebody gets up in a pulpit and says, I want you to imagine blah, 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 blah. Because then you're kind of letting the congregation know,
right,
hey, you know, this may or may not be true.
Right.
But if you get up and you present something that you heard another preacher use as a fact, and you haven't done your homework to fact check it, to make sure that that was a true account, you better be careful.
What about like a story like of a man losing his wallet, and you don't specifically know the man, but you know there's been men who've lost wallets, and you don't give a name, you just give a fictitious name. You see what I'm saying? or like a parable.
Don't you think it's better, though, Dustin, to let the people know right up front that this is a hypothetical or theoretical story,
Yeah.
and you're not trying to pawn it off as true?
Yeah, and I think like what I feel is you just never hear that. You know what I mean? You never hear.
No, you
somebody
don't.
come up and you hear say, "This is a hypothetical man named Jim," and you tell the story, and that's why I was like, I mean, I guess that'd be cool if you got there and did that. I guess people would just respect that.
Well, let's talk about one other little preaching issue before I call on Dean. How about when you totally lift somebody else's sermon, even though you've maybe gotten permission from them, you've gotten their PowerPoint slides, but then you get up and present it as your own?
Right.
How many times have you guys actually heard preachers say, anywhere in a lesson, this material was from Neil Pollard, or this material was from Billy Bob Smith?
I have.
Have you? That's good. I mean, because in the grand scheme of things, even though in that person's eyes it may seem, well, you know, I'm devaluing myself, what they're really doing is saying, look, I'm a guy of integrity. I'm going to tell you where this stuff came from.
Right.
Now, the catch on that, though, is in a lot of these quote-unquote great sermons, they have been passed around so much, you may never find the original author. You know, Joe Blow may have got it from Bobby Duncan, and Bobby Duncan may have got it from so-and-so, and, you know, it just keeps on going back and back and back. Dean, you got a comment?
Oh, I was going to ask, would it be better than if a preacher were to qualify an illustration by saying, now I don't know whether this is true or not, and then give the illustrations?
I'll tell you my gut reaction to what you just said. If I'm sitting in a congregation and that came out of your mouth, I would say, why are you saying it then? Why are you even, if you don't know it's true or not, why are you putting me wasting 3 minutes of my precious time that I'll never get back having to listen to this?
Well, because what if it's a powerful illustration?
Well, then you right up front you say, I want you to consider the following hypothetical situation, or consider this story, so that they know
It's just semantics.
it's a story. It is a teaching tool and not you trying to pass it off as true information.
Right.
Other thing that I really kind of irks my nerves on occasion, and this is something I struggle with personally. I consider myself in the information getting out business. So I let people have anything they want. If you want to use my articles, my PowerPoints, whatever, I don't care. I don't charge. You can have it. But how many times have we written something and then we find somebody grabbing pretty good chunks of it and using it in their own bulletin articles or their own article to a gospel journal or whatever? And you look at that and you're thinking, man, that's pretty much word for word what I said or what I wrote. There again, guys, that's no good. If you're going to use somebody's stuff, at least have the common decency to give them credit for it, because that's intellectual property, meaning that person owns that outright, and so that proper credit needs to be given. John.
Appreciate what the instructors here, Bob Turner and Wayne Roberts, has done for us in homiletics as far as illustrations go, is to keep our eyes and our ears in tune to our environment, to the local news, to national news,
Absolutely,
what's going on around our world, so that we can come up with fresh illustrations, so that we're not having to always, whip out an illustrations book that dates back to 1950 or something from some preacher, or looking back on our life and looking at events in our lives where we could pull out an illustration that will apply to our lesson. So the school here is doing a good job of trying to.
Great. Anytime you can personalize something that if you've been through it, it's going to resonate a lot stronger with the congregation. And like John said, if there are things that are going on currently that's going to make a whole lot of difference. I'll give you an example. I had a preacher recently. I was sitting in the congregation, and he was doing a lesson on why do we partake of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. So, basic sermon. Any of you guys could have presented it very well, very easily. He doctrinally was 100% sound, dead on, spot on, had, 8 or 10 PowerPoint slides supporting his conclusion. But overall, I thought his message came up somewhat lacking, because here in Nashville, we've got 2 or 3 congregations who are now starting to serve the Lord's Supper on Saturday night. He never mentioned that. He never mentioned people, basically, why is this a big deal in the first place? He never brought in any current examples, any kind of current stuff, so that the people in the congregation were looking, going, hey, this is relevant. I understand why we're talking about this. I'm glad to hear this, because now I'll have a tool that I can use when my buddy who goes to Otter Creek says, hey, why don't you come to church with me Saturday? We're having the rock band and taking the Lord's Supper, and you can get out early and sleep late Sunday. Anything else on those? All right. Switch gears just a little bit. That was some of the stuff I wanted to follow up with on last Thursday. We're going to transition into business ethics. A topic that you don't hear a whole lot of, unfortunately, especially in situations like where you guys are with preaching schools in the church. We don't talk much about business ethics, and I think that's, in a way, it's a shame, because when you think about it, all of us know of businesses that are doing unscrupulous things or have done things or have fallen, the Enrons, all these different corporations that have big scandals. But nobody ever stops to talk about the fact that, what is behind the scandal? Why are we seeing more of these scandals? So here's where I want us to start. If you evaluate a business, you evaluate their goals, their objectives, you ask the question, what is, whether it's McDonald's or Walmart or the corner coffee shop or whatever, what is their highest aspiration? Is it profits, which for many companies, that is the bottom line? Is it fame, meaning, are they trying to build a name and a brand that will be recognized globally? Do they want to be known for a particular product? Hey, we make the best burgers, or we make the best cars in the world. Are they wanting to be popular? In other words, are they wanting to saturate the market with lots of stores, lots of signs where everybody recognizes them? Or is it an integrity issue? As you look at those 5 things, here's what I want you to remember. If integrity is second to any of those other alternatives, then basically they've already lost. Because at some point in that business's career, whether they're trying to decide on how to dispose of waste, or whether they're deciding, should they use a cheaper product to sell to consumers, at some point they're going to make a choice. If they don't have integrity as the top number, that is going to negatively impact everything else. So we look, for instance, recent Wall Street Journal article. Psychology professor Stephen Davis says that cheating by high school students has increased from 20% to 75% today. Students say cheating in high school is for grades. Notice this. Cheating in college is for a career. So in other words, they believe they've justified it in their minds by saying, well, in high school we got to get good grades to get into a good college. Well, in college we got to get good grades in order to get a good career, to get into a Fortune 500 company. What do you think happens when they leave academia and school? Do you think that this ethical, suddenly somebody flicks a switch and now these guys are morally straight and they don't cheat? No, it follows them into the business world. Here's what the professors think. There's a survey done in college faculty. 187 professors responded to it. Notice the first thing. They graded these 1 to 5, where 1 was I strongly disagree, 5 was I strongly agree. First question, the importance of ethics and personal integrity should be stressed in courses I teach. They rated that a 4.75, which is pretty high. Second thing, the basis for ethics and personal integrity should be discussed. In other words, how we discern what is right and wrong needs to be a part of that. And again, 4.11 is still very, very strongly agreed with by all of these professors. But if you think about it for just a moment, look at question 2 very carefully. The basis for ethics, as we've talked about it in this class the whole time, you got to have a standard. Our standard is the Bible. What do you think the standard is going to be at a state university?
The media, the public.
Basically whatever feels right, or what is good for the most, or some of the other ethical morals that we talked about. This is a quote by Teddy Roosevelt. He asked about, can ethics be taught? He came up, he said, to educate a person in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace in society. Alan Bloom, if you guys have not read this book, The Closing of the American Mind, you might want to take a look at it. He says that the eternal conflict between good and evil has been replaced with I'm okay, you're okay. He said students unthinkably embrace a blind tolerance in which they consider it moral never to think that they're right because that means someone else is wrong. So in a person's mind today, a young person's mind, they don't want to think of it as right and wrong. Because basically they're going by this I'm okay, you're okay mentality. 200 years ago, Professor Alexander Tyler wrote The Athenian Republic, which had fallen 2,000 years later. Guys, watch this very carefully. In fact, this may come back to visit you next Thursday. He said a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. The average age of the world's greatest civilization has been about 200 years. Look at this sequence. He says the nations have progressed through this sequence from bondage to spiritual faith, to great courage, to abundance, then to selfishness, to complacency, to apathy, to dependency, and then back to bondage. Guys, that should scare you to death because we are literally on like the last 2 or 3 points right there. We are somewhere between apathetic and now we're growing in a dependent state. I'm not preaching politics to you today, but socialism is a very dependency-deprived state. George Washington's farewell address, he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in the exclusion, notice this, of religious principle. In other words, Washington realized you've got to have a religious factor, a standard, if there's going to be morality. Ethics essential to the functioning of a free society. Second U.S. President, John Adams, he observed, we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. In other words, you throw out religion and morals, and our Constitution doesn't work. Because it is dependent on people who have a conscience and know right from wrong, good from bad. God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can these liberties of nation be secure when we have removed the conviction that these liberties are a gift from God? Thomas Jefferson said, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and his justice cannot sleep forever. An issue of management accounting, James Bragner stated, the universities are responding with increased emphasis on ethical training for decision making. For the most part, however, they ignore the teaching of values. For moral or ethical education to have meaning, there must be an agreement on the values that are considered right. So think about that for just a minute. We're increasing our emphasis on ethical training in the business world. But we never say ultimately what is right and what is wrong. We basically are saying you need to do right, you need to do good. Well, how do you define right and good? His point here is they don't do that. They don't define those values. Because there would have to be an agreement, and that agreement, obviously, as we've talked about in this class, will be the Bible. Michael Josephson, in Chapter 1 of Ethical Issues in the Practice of Accounting, describes 10 universal values. Those 10 values are honesty, integrity, promise-keeping, fidelity, fairness, caring, respect of others, responsible citizenship, pursuit of excellence, and accountability. The reason I show you this, guys, if you look at those characteristics, you're talking basically about what the New Testament is trying to teach people to be. We're supposed to be honest people. New Testament Christians should have integrity. They should keep their promises. We're not breeding a bunch of infidels. We should be fair in our business practices. We should care about others, respect others, be responsible citizens. Jeffrey Lentos, he said, until about 50 years ago, it was commonly accepted that universities were to provide students not only with knowledge and skills, but also moral guidance based on the essentials of the Western tradition. There again, you've got these words like moral guidance and values that keep coming up as a cornerstone to everything that we're talking about. Many of you may read Cal Thomas in the newspaper. He's a very conservative author, columnist. He wrote a book called The Death of Ethics in America, in which he said if we want to produce people who share the values of a democratic culture, they must be taught those values and not be left to acquire them simply by chance. So, in looking at our history and looking at where Americans are, it's pretty obvious. We've got to have some kind of a standard. So we move this discussion into looking at businesses. What kind of relations, what kind of things are going on in the business world that would affect folks one way or another? You've got, obviously, employee-employer relations. Ethical dilemmas come up. We're going to talk about, we're going to read a bunch of those here in just a minute. You've got employer-employee relations. In other words, if you're the boss, there may be some ethical dilemmas. You've got a company versus a customer relation. You got a company versus the shareholder relations. If somebody's putting in money into your organization, wanting profits and wanting the company to grow, they expect the truth when you report the finances. You've got company community or public interest. In other words, if your company is making a new widget, and that widget's the greatest thing since sliced bread, but it produces a byproduct of toxin that has to be disposed of, and you're calling up the third shift people and you're just dumping it every single night without anybody knowing about it, that's not exactly in their best interest. Here's what we're going to do. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of business ethics, I'm going to call each one of you up. Actually, I won't call you up, but I'll just call on you. We'll go around the room. I've got several case studies that I want you to listen to. You're going to have to listen very carefully. These are lengthy, and they all present a different type of thing. We're going to start, we'll start with James up front. Front left, we'll just work our way around the room. Again, these are long. They are detailed. But I want you to listen and be prepared because I'm going to ask James some questions about his first, and then we're going to move on to everybody else. It says, John Peters had just arrived at the main offices of Dreyer & Sons from the Midwest State University. medium-sized company, DNS manufactured components for several of the major defense contractors in the United States. Recently, DNS started a specialized software division and had hired John as a salesperson for both the company's hardware and software. A diligent student at Midwest State, John had earned degrees in engineering and management information systems. His minor was in marketing, specifically in sales. Because of his education as well as other activities, John was not only comfortable discussing numbers with engineers, but he also had the people skills to convey complex situations and solutions in understandable terms. This was one of the main reasons why he had been hired by one of the owners. DNS was established during World War II and manufactured parts for military aircraft during the Korean War. They had become a stable subcontractor for specialized parts in aircraft and missiles. When the owner, Al Dreyer, and his father started the business, Al was a salesperson for the company. In time, DNS had grown to employ several hundred workers with 5 salespeople. John was the 6th. During his first few months in the company, John got his bearings in the defense industry. For example, when Ed, his trainer, would take procurement people out to lunch, everybody would put money into a jar on the table. The money was collected usually was much less than the bill. But Ed would make up the difference. Golf was a skill that Ed had required John to learn because he told John that many times that's where deals would take place. Again, Ed would indirectly pick up the golfing bill, which sometimes totaled several $100s. Another of Ed's requirements was that John read the Procurement Integrity section of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy Act and the the Federal Acquisition Regulation Act, which implements the Act. John had read the certificate, he'd read the integrity documents, and as he read the documents, he noted that Section 27A2 forbid agents to offer, give, or promise any money, any gratuity, anything of value to any such agency. So he asked Ed, he said, doesn't this relate to what we're doing? Ed's response, yes and no, my boy, yes and no, was his only answer. One Monday, when Ed and John had returned from a sales call in St. Louis and Washington, Ed called John into his office, said, John, you don't have your numbers right here for our expenses. He said, you're 15% short because you forgot all of your tips. As John looked at his list of expenses, he realized Ed was right. There was no item on his expense report for such things. So he asked his trainer, Ed, where did I put these? There's no line on the form for this. So Ed told him, he said, I just do what I've always done. Just add it to the cost of things. As John looked at Ed's report, he noticed some numbers that seemed quite large. Why don't we mention this problem to Mr. Dreyer so that accounting can put extra lines on the reports? Ed said, because this is the way we do things around here, and they don't like changes to the system. We have a saying in the company that a blind eye goes a long way to getting business done. Ed lectured John. John didn't quite grasp the problem as he was told. On another trip, John learned the difference between working directly with the federal government procurement people and the companies with which DNS subcontracted. For example, certain conversations of a large defense contractor were relayed to DNS, and then Ed and John would visit certain government agencies and relay that information. In one case, Ed and John were told to relay a very large offer to an official who was entering the private sector the next year. In addition, Ed and John were used in obtaining information on requests for proposals as well as other competitive information for this procurement. When John asked Ed about this, Ed said, John, in order to excel in business, you need not be an expert on knowing exactly where things become legal and illegal. Trust me, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never had a problem. Why do you think I'm your trainer? John started reviewing more government documents and asking the other salespeople about Ed. 2 replied that Ed was a smart operator, that he knew the ropes better than anybody in the company. The other 2 salespeople had a different story to tell. One of them said, has he tried to explain away his padding to you yet on his expense reports? John very quietly said, well, I thought everyone does that. The other salesperson said, Ed has been doing business with the feds and large defense companies for so long that he sometimes doesn't realize the rules have changed. He's been lucky that nobody has caught him yet. Watch your step, John, or you're going to find yourself with dirty hands and know where to clean them. At the end of another trip to Washington, D.C., Ed called John into his office. John, your numbers don't add up again. He said, didn't I tell you to add at least 15% to your totals for tips and miscellaneous items? Let's get with it. Do you want to be in training forever? You know that I have to sign off before you can go it alone. I want to make sure you understand the ropes. Just between you and me, I think Dreyer is finally going to make a vice president slot, which should go to me because of my seniority. So hurry up, learn this stuff, because you're my last trainee. Just sign the documents with the revised numbers on them. Mr. Coker, what should John do?
You should not embellish. You should not add the 15% to the expense reports, because that's unethical. I mean, if there's not a line for it, then they don't want you to claim it. Claim that money.
Let's define what exactly is his ethical dilemma.
His ethical dilemma seems to be that, it's that his trainer is willing to compromise ethics in order just to get jobs done, whether it's expense reports or shaving money here or there. He's just trying to compromise ethics for the sake of getting the job done. That's, I guess, the overall picture. Specifically, he's having to deal with turning in reports that he wants to get reimbursed for using money, but he's trying to get more money back, or at least that's what he's being trained to do. And he's, being assured that that's just the way it is, and this is just the way things have always been. So just hurry up and do it, so you quit being in this training mode, and you could just get a job or get your position.
Legally speaking, what are some of the things that John will have to worry about, either about himself or about the company, if he takes the road you said?
Of quitting or not doing. If he takes the position of being ethical, is that what you're saying?
Because let's be honest, James, if he does what you're saying, that's going to out a rat.
Okay.
And then they're going to go back and they're probably going to pull files for years and see that this rat has been with them a long time. And then they're also going to start looking at the contracts made with this defense organizations. So what is he doing legally to himself and to the company?
I think to himself, he's clearing himself. I mean, if he continues with the company and he continues doing some unethical things, then somebody else would come along and then report the rat or open up a can of worms or whatever. So I'd rather be the one that opens up the can of worms on the company instead of have the can of worms opened on me.
Okay.
I mean, that's I guess, a selfish way of explaining it, but I mean, it's the right thing to do. You should just let the chips fall where they may.
John.
He'll be accountable for his documentation that he submitted, but that's only about 2 or 3 months worth probably, compared to the 15 years worth of his trainers. He may be exonerated from that. I don't know, because he's under a training situation, but it's the risk that I guess you'd have to take.
Okay, Dean.
Well, basically, if this guy is in line to be the vice president of the company and he gets ratted out, basically what has just happened is the main character here is basically ripping down a company from top to bottom, because they're going to be because even if several years go by and all these people go to jail, there's not going to be one person that's going to want to do business with these guys. Based on shot.
All right, so are all of you guys, everybody in there, pretty much in favor of? Well, let me ask you, what? Give me 3 scenarios, 3 possibles.
I think if he reports it, that if he does so, he might be excused from whatever few infractions he's committed, just, I guess, out of the sake of ignorance or the sake of basically paying towards the government.
Option number 1 is he basically just reports the whole thing, full out, full Monty. Here's the deal. Option number 2 is he looks his trainer in the face and says, I'm not padding my numbers. I'm turning in what I turned in. Or option number 3 is he changes his numbers. What's good about option 1, 2, or 3?
Well, option 2 gives his trainer one last opportunity to make a better choice for himself and for the company. But
Okay.
ultimately, it may wind up leading back to choice number 1. Because if the trainer refuses to accept that, then whistleblowing is
Well, think
option.
about this. Let's say that all he does is say, I'm not changing my numbers. His trainer changes his numbers.
Mm-hmm.
They go through another 2 months, and all of a sudden he signs off on this guy, says, here you go. And now he's put as vice president, and he goes back to his old ways. Does John at that stage have any grounds to stand on at all, going to the superiors in this company saying, hey, I should have told you this earlier, but I didn't?
No.
Are you talking about?
Or does he have to live with it?
You're talking about with regard to so his trainer gets bumped up and continues to do shady stuff, and then John
Right.
goes to him later and says, I knew this guy was doing shady stuff way back when.
Yeah. Because see, if I'm the boss, the big boss, and John comes to me after the fact, I'm wanting to know, why didn't I hear about this
Right.
earlier?
Vice president.
Well, and that's why I say ultimately the second choice would have to lead back to the first choice.
Okay. Chuck?
More than likely, this guy Ed, who's going to be bumped up to being vice president, he was probably taught by somebody who's even a higher rank than he is on how to do, how to claim things. So John going to the people who are higher than Ed may not be the best choice for him, and he may just have to go straight to the government.
Okay. So basically go over all their heads.
Basically.
Do you guys see any way that he keeps his job?
No.
Only if he goes to the government and they put all these guys in the slammer and the new president's like, hey.
He's the only one left standing.
Yeah.
All right.
That's it.
Listen up. Chris, this is a real-life situation.
Yes.
Names have been changed. Frank Garcia was just starting out as a salesman with Acme Corporation. Acme's corporate culture was top-down or hierarchical. Because of the competitive nature of medical supply industry, few mistakes were tolerated. Otis Hillman was a buyer for Thermacare, a national hospital chain. Frank's first meeting with Otis was a huge success, resulting in a $500,000 contract. The sale represented a significant increase for Acme and a $1,000 bonus for Frank. Some months later, Frank called on Thermacare again, seeking to increase the contract by another $500,000. Otis, I think you need the additional inventory. It looks like you didn't have enough at the end of last quarter, said Frank. Otis said, you may be right. Business has picked up. Maybe it's because of your product, but then again, maybe not. He said, it's still not clear to me whether Acme is the best for us. Speaking of which, I heard that you have season tickets to the Cubs, replied Otis. Frank thought for a moment and said, Otis, I know that part of your increases are due to our quality products. How about we discuss this over a ball game? Otis agreed. By the seventh inning stretch, Frank had convinced Otis that an additional inventory was needed. He offered to give Thermacare a pair of season tickets to boot. Frank's boss, Amber, heard of the sale. She was very pleased. Frank, this is great. We've been trying to get Thermacare's business for a long time. You seem to have connected with their buyer. As a result of the ThermoCare account, Frank received another large bonus check and a letter of achievement from the Vice President of Marketing. 2 quarters later, Frank had become one of the top producers in his division. At the beginning of the quarter, Frank ran the numbers again on ThermoCare's account, showed that Otis's business could probably handle another $750,000 worth of goods without hurting them. As Frank went over the numbers with Otis, Otis' response was, "You know, Frank, I've really enjoyed the season tickets, but this is a big increase." As the conversation meandered, Frank soon found out that Otis and his wife had never been to Cancun, Mexico. Frank had never been in a situation like this before, so he excused himself into another room. He called his supervisor, Amber, and told him what he was thinking of doing. "Are you kidding?" responded Amber. "Why are you even calling me on this? I'll find the money to pay for the trip somewhere." "Is this okay with Acme?" asked Frank. She said, "You let me worry about that." Frank suggested to Otis and his wife be his guest in Cancun, and the conversation seemed to go very smoothly. In fact, in Cancun, Otis decided to purchase additional goods, for which Frank received another bonus and another positive letter for his file. Sometime later, Amber announced to all of her division that they would be taking all of their best clients to Las Vegas for a thank you party. One of those invited was, in fact, ThermoCare and Otis. When they arrived, Amber gave each person $500 and said, "I want you to know that Acme is very grateful for your business that you provided us. As a result of your understanding the qualitative differences of our products, we've doubled our production facilities. This trip and everything that goes with it for the next few days is our small way of saying thank you. Every one of your salespeople are here. If there's anything that you need, you please let him or her know, and we'll try to accommodate you. Have a great time." That night, Otis had seen Frank at dinner and suggested to him he was interested in attending an adult entertainment club. When Frank came to Amber about this, she said, "Is he asking you to go with him?" "No, Amber, not me." "Well, then if he's not asking you to go, I don't understand why you're talking to me. Didn't I say that we'll take care of their needs?" Frank said, "Yeah, but well, what will Acme say if this gets out that we're paying for this man to go to an adult club?" "Don't worry about it," Amber said. "It won't get out." All right. Chris,
Yes, sir.
you're Frank. What do you do?
Well, I would instantly recall, if I were Frank and if I had Chris Blocker's brain, the story that Chris Blocker just saw on the news about the Republicans and the Democrats and being raked over the coals about operating strip clubs with party funds and hiring strippers.
Yes.
And different things.
Yes, Michael Steele problem.
Yes, sir. And I would think, and I would recall from Chris Blocker's brain the thought that he had as he watched this news article that, boy, that's really bad, and they probably didn't think that would get out either. And if they had chosen to make the ethical choice in the first place, they would never be in the situation that they find themselves in now. Because I had access to those thoughts from Chris Blocker's brain, I would then, being Frank, make the choice to go over Amber's head and inform her boss about what was about to go down, and,
Okay, her boss is Mr. Mellon, and Mr. Mellon says profits rule.
say, well, with all due respect, Mr. Mellon, they don't. And I've made you a lot of money for this company, and I would do this. And I would say, I've made a lot of money for you for this company, and I'm not going to be a part of it. So I'm going to take my bonus checks. If this is your position, I'm going to start a rival company and put you out of business.
And I will sue you for non-compete clause, and you're going to jail.
Well,
No, I'm just kidding. Chris, let me ask you this, because in a way, you bid on the obvious.
Yes.
You know, the obvious is, does a company want to get caught up in sending somebody to a topless bar?
That's right.
But you didn't address any of the other things that Frank had slid him on.
Okay. And I thought about that as you were reading that. Is there anything unethical if the company is okay with buying tickets or buying dinners or treating their, taking their clients out to fancy restaurants or whatever? Is there anything? There's nothing unethical about any of those activities, and so long as the company is okay with it and there's nothing illegal about it, then they haven't crossed any ethical lines. The ethical line is crossed when you get into something that is immoral.
All right.
Surplus.
Then let's bring it home to morals for just a minute on the same kind of thing.
Okay.
Let's say instead of working for Acme, that you work for a pharmaceutical company.
Now, there are
and
laws.
as a pharmaceutical rep,
And that's
you go into a doctor's office every single week, and all you basically do is say, look, if you prescribe our antibiotic over another one, you're going to have a trip to Cancun, and I'm providing lunch to your office 3 days a week.
And that changes things, though, because there are laws. There are different laws that govern the pharmaceutical industry, and doctors and so forth. So,
but what's the if I'm a doctor and I'm looking at you and I can prescribe a generic form of amoxicillin,
right?
Or I can prescribe a name brand Avalox.
Right.
Both are going to kill the bacteria that I'm wanting them to kill. But I know that the Avalox rep was in my office yesterday, and he brought me some really, really good, these wonderful croissants and these desserts to die for.
I would tell him.
And after all, it's not affecting my pocketbook.
Doesn't matter.
Although the generic amoxicillin costs like $4, the Avalox costs about $70.
Doesn't matter. Is it legal?
Absolutely, it's legal.
It's legal for me to do that.
Yep. But is it ethical?
Okay.
There's a difference.
No. If there are laws specifically governing that sort of thing, then that changes things, because if you're breaking the law, then it becomes unethical.
He's not breaking the law, because he's prescribing a drug that is in the diagnostic manual that you can use for that particular disease, disorder, infection. Even though deep down in his heart of hearts he knows that a cheaper one will do just the same.
So you're saying, so then it becomes the salesperson's responsibility to make sure that a doctor is doing right by his clients?
I'm asking you, is it right for that doctor to prescribe Avalox, a name brand drug that he knows is going to have to cost a lot more?
Is
Even
it right
though
for the doctor to do that? No.
Since that person has government
technically,
health insurance, he's not going to worry about
So
it.
you're saying, is it ethical for the doctor to try to price gouge his patients to get a golf trip? No, of course not. And
okay.
if I have an issue with that, then I should stop working for Avalox and I should go work for the generic company.
Okay.
Because
Let's
I'm
look
going
for
to run into that. If I work for the company, the pharmaceutical company that manufactures the name brand drug, then every single sales call that I go on, I'm going to run into that. So I should get out of that business. Not everybody should go work for the generic company.
We're going to keep going. I'm going to chuck your next, so be ready. But I wanted us to look at, what are some of the issues in ethics? What are some of the things that folks are facing? Obviously, you've got abusive behavior. That can mean verbal abuse. That can mean physical abuse. We're going to talk a little bit later on about, things like sweatshops, where you're putting people in a working environment that is less than normal, less than desirable, but you're cranking out product at a much cheaper rate
Good job, Kathy Lee.
so that you win the market. Obviously, harassment. Sexual harassment obviously comes to the top, but that's not the only form. You've got accounting frauds. You've got conflicts of interest, where let me give you guys an example of what would be a conflict of interest. work at a place that publishes books and prints a magazine. And right now, the way the organization is set up, I get to make the decisions about who we use to print our stuff. And I pull the trigger and say, pay them a big old fat check. Well, if a friend comes to me and says, hey, I've got this printing company, I'll give you kickbacks if you use our printing company. That is a conflict of interest, so to speak, because all of a sudden I'm the guy who holds the purse strings, and I'm the guy who gets to make the decision, and I'm getting, some kind of bonus on the back side of it. Obviously, defective products. We've heard a lot about those lately with the Toyota deal. We talked a little bit briefly about the Firestone tire deal. There is robbery that goes on and employee theft, all of those kinds of things. And we know that this is prevalent in all areas of business. We see it in politics a lot. I don't know if I haven't come down yet on whether or not politicians are, just as a general rule, if they are unethical, or if we just hear about it more because they are somewhat in the spotlight. But I do know this. I know we get far too much garbage out of D.C. when compared to a regular society. You've got sports things, doping, betting, gambling. If you're an ump or if you're a ref, and let's say that, you're reffing for the national championship game, and this dude named Dean Meadows calls you up and says, hey, I got $100,000 on the Blue Devils. Can you throw the game for me, and I'll give you half of it.
That's what happened.
And the guy says, Dean who? You got manufacturing issues. Say a company is making something and there's a competitor out there that is producing something cheaper, so they move to cheaper ingredients or cheaper product, even though it might not be as stable or might actually pose a health risk. Obviously, we know about investing problems. Everybody there should know about Bernie Madoff, those kinds of Ponzi schemes, those kinds of things where people are basically taken for a ride. If you look at a recent Gallup poll, finds that 17 to 20% of the public thought the business ethics of executives was very high or high, meaning only 17 to 20% we think are actually ethical guys, good guys that are leading moral lives. That's pretty sad. That means basically when you look across Wall Street, the public perception is these guys are out for one thing and one thing only. To understand public sentiment towards business, ask these three questions. Number one, has the business ethics really deteriorated? Number two, are the media reporting ethical problems more frequently and vigorously? Number three, are practices that once were socially acceptable no longer acceptable? So are we really seeing an increase in ethical issues, or are there things that we don't nod and wink at anymore? Question, if a company hires good people with strong ethical values, will it be a good organization?
Yes.
Potentially.
You think so?
Sure.
So you think personal ethics automatically rolls into business ethics?
Sure.
Because it's ran by people.
I disagree with you on that. Because, Chris, what if you got somebody who is somewhat ethical at home, but when it comes to money and profits, all they see is green?
Well, yeah.
And
then there's an inconsistency. They're not moral people because ethics requires consistency.
okay, but what is their standard of good?
Well, Well, it's obvious.
We're not talking about religious people here.
Okay.
We're talking about people who quote unquote would call themselves good in the public side.
Okay. But are they ethical? Because what is the standard of ethics? Is it a shifting standard, or is there one universal standard for ethics?
That's the point.
Right.
And if you got a worldly person who has strong ethical values, well, that means nothing if you don't have a standard.
Well, then they don't have strong ethical values if they don't have a standard, because ethical values.
Sure they do.
Demand a standard.
You can have ethical values without being a Christian.
Okay.
They're not right. But it may be that their strong ethical values are whatever is good for the greatest number of people. That's what's good.
So are they ethical or not?
Brad, your definition of ethical is being in accordance with the accepted principles of right and wrong that govern the conduct of the profession. So if they're in that profession, then they will be doing the right thing. So yes, it would be a good company.
Okay. If a company hires good people who have an ethical value system based around whatever is good for the majority, or if they have an ethical standard of whatever brings about the most pleasure,
So basically,
or might is right.
the question is deceptive.
That's humanism.
The question's deceptive.
Yes.
Nah.
Question's unethical. It's too vague. It's too vague. Right.
This is a snapshot over the last 40 years.
You have an answer, which is this scenario. You can't do that.
Brad,
Yeah.
would you please stop being a liberal?
This is a snapshot over the last 40 years, guys. If you look on here, what I did was try to put some of the ethical dilemmas that we were facing. For instance, in the 60s, a lot was focusing on civil rights, environmental issues, drug issues. When you move to the 70s, all of a sudden things like human rights began popping up, and people wanted a minimum wage for earners. They wanted more equal rights in things like factories. You know, should have air conditioning. They should have 2 breaks a day with 1 hour lunch, and yada yada yada. In the 1980s, it was a time of bribes, illegal contracting. There was a lot of deceptive advertising going on. There weren't ethical standards for many of the deceptive ads. So they had to basically revamp and rethink that. 1990s, we get into sweatshops overseas. Name somebody that's tied to a sweatshop. Nike.
Yeah.
Kathy Lee Gifford. I mean, she's got a clothing line that's being done by 9-year-olds overseas.
Pretty much anybody does this in China.
Folks in China. Right now, in the 1990s, if you look into the second little block there, it talks about rising corporate liability. All of a sudden, courts realize, you know what? Some of these companies are producing things that are hazardous. And so suddenly, companies started realizing, oops, we may have to pay for our bad behavior. It was also in the 1990s that a lot of financial mismanagement started being uncovered. Year 2000, we've got cyber crimes, we've got major financial management problems, international corruption. So as you look at that list, you can see how ethical things have always plagued our society. And unfortunately, I think one of the things that we need to learn from this is ethical situations many times outpace our laws and our understanding of what is right and wrong as a society in general. All right, Mr. Chuck, I'm going to give you a scenario here. Carla knew something was wrong when Jack got back to his desk. He had been with Acre and Acre Accounting for 17 years. Starting there right after graduation, progressing through the ranks, Jack was a strong supporter of the company, and that's why Carla had been assigned to him. Carla had been with A&A for 2 years. She graduated in the top 10% of her class, passed the CPA exam on the first try. She had chosen A&A over one of the big 5 firms because A&A was the biggest and best firm in Smallville, Ohio. Smallville, Ohio was where her husband, Frank, managed a local-owned machine tool company. She and Frank had just purchased a new house. Things were going great, when all of a sudden, things started to turn strange with Jack, her boss. She asked him, "What's the matter?" Jack said, "Well, you'll hear about it sooner or later." He said, "I've been denied a partner's position." Can you imagine that? He said, "I'm working 60 to 70 hours a week for the last 10 years. All that management can say to me is not at this time." Carla asked, "So what else did they say?" Jack turned bright red. He blurted out, "They said that maybe in a few more years. I've done all that they've asked me to do. I've sacrificed a lot. And now they say a few more years. It's not fair." Carla asked him, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I don't know. I just do not know." 6 months later, Carla noticed that Jack was behaving oddly. He came in late. He left early. One Sunday, Carla went into the office for some files. She found Jack copying some of the software that AA used in auditing and consulting. A couple of weeks later at a dinner party, Carla overheard a conversation about Jack doing consulting work for small firms on the side. Monday morning, she asked him if what she had heard was true, and he responded, "Yeah, Carla, it's true. I have a few clients that I do some work for on occasion." Carla asked, "Don't you think that there's a conflict of interest between you and AA?" Jack said, "No. As I see it, these clients are not technically within the market area of AA. Besides, I was counting on that promotion from making a partner to help me pay some extra bills." He said, "My oldest son decided to go to a private college, which is an extra $25,000 a year. Plus, our medical plan at AA doesn't cover some of the medical problems, and you don't want to know the cost of what's going on in our home. The only way that I can afford to pay for these things is to do extra work on the side." "But what if AA finds out?" Carla said. "Won't they terminate you?" He said, "I don't want to think about that. Besides, if they don't find out for another 6 months, I may be able to start my own company." "How?" asked Carla. "Don't be naive, Carla. You know that you came in that Sunday, and you saw what I was doing." Carla realized that Jack had been using AA software for his own gain. "That's stealing," she said. "Stealing?" Jack asked. He said, "You mean like when you use the office phones for personal long-distance calls? Or like when you decided to volunteer to help out for your church and copy all of their stuff on a copy machine? If I'm stealing, you're a thief as well. But let's not get into this discussion. I'm not hurting AA, and who knows, maybe within the next year I'll become a partner and can quit my night job." Carla backed off from the discussion, said nothing more. She couldn't afford to antagonize her boss and risked a bad performance rating. She and Frank had bills too. She also knew that she wouldn't be able to get another job at the same pay if she quit. Moving to another town was not an option because of Frank's business. She had no physical evidence to talk to partners, which meant that it would be her word against Jack's, and he had 17 years of experience on her. Chuck, what ethical issues is Carla really facing?
The ethical issues she is facing, one is the fact that she's done pretty much the same thing, maybe to a lesser extent, but ethically it was still wrong. She also has the dilemma of whether or not to hightail it out of that town because of Jack's experience. But one thing I think she does have at her advantage is that Jack was denied a partnership. So she does have a little bit more clout than Jack in that because he's seeking to rise. But her only option is to first go to him, which she seems to have already done, and try to talk him out of using AA's software and asking him to stop developing the same thing and selling it elsewhere. But she has to go above.
Let me ask you this question, Chuck. What additional information, if you are Carla, What else do you want to know before you pull the trigger on it?
Concerning the software or concerning Jack?
Yes. Is there anything else you would like to know before you go over his head?
I'm not thinking straight.
Okay. Guys, what do you think? Are there any pieces of the puzzle that you'd want to know? Anthony?
How long has he been doing this, and exactly how much has he been stealing? Not necessarily is more information going to make it right to go to his boss, but the more evidence you have, the better.
Okay. So, how long has this behavior been going on? And exactly what has he gotten so far? Because that can be a pretty huge thing. I'm going to put this slide up just for fun. We'll touch on it briefly for just a second. These are items that are commonly stole from an office.
Oh, goodness.
At the top of the list are pens and pencils. No, man, paper clips aren't stolen. Post-it notes, envelopes, notepads, paper. These are actually the top 5 according to one of the surveys. What do you think? When you look at that list, I'll be honest with you guys, I have taken some pens, not necessarily on purpose, but I'll pick them up and write with them and stick them in my bag or whatever. Ethically speaking, do you think human beings look at that and say, well, those are small priced items?
I think they do.
I asked a question like that. Sure. But you got a business taking 5,000.
Yes.
But is there realistically a difference?
Not really.
No.
Okay.
But you know what, Brad?
What if it says pen and pencil at the top, if I said it was a Mont Blanc pen, would that make a difference?
No.
Oh, what?
Versus a 3-cent big throwaway disposable.
Unless you have permission to.
$80 pins. I think it'd make a difference.
Brad,
Yes.
I asked a question like that on my survey, and 73% of the people said that they thought that it was not okay to do that.
73%.
Of those 73%, 100%.
But think about this. If you were to ask those people and they were actually honest with you, how many of you have used, say, office envelopes to mail a bill in?
Oh, I didn't ask
Or-
if they had done that. I said they thought it was okay. Yes, yes.
Are you asking
But
us?
the funny thing is, we don't, when it's us doing it, we don't view it as really stealing it. I got to write down what I need to buy at the grocery store on the way in. So I'm going to grab this Post-it note, even though that Post-it note belongs to so-and-so company. We just basically, it's like, oh, it's just a little piece of paper. Well, the company had to buy that piece of paper. So if you guys are in a position, and I'm throwing this out because, again, we're dealing in real life stuff. If a secretary that you work with in a church setting is knowingly, repeatedly taking stuff, how do you address that?
Fire.
Okay. Dean is going to write a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Shouldn't steal.
Dan, what would you do?
I would talk to her about it, not by myself, but with somebody else, another lady or something, and then.
Okay.
You definitely have to tell her to explain to her the ethical values of it, was what she was doing is wrong,
Okay.
and then base your decision
Let
on
me-
how
let
she,
me-
how she takes the, how she takes the truth.
Let me ask you this. How many of you guys would, before you do that, preach a sermon on ethics, right and wrong? I probably would. To lay some foundation so that hopefully she catches on and realizes, oops, what I'm doing is not right. Because, again, that's a teachable moment. Take a look at this chart right here. This is part of the problem that we face in business ethics. Organization A is a typical organization where each arrow represents an employee. And when you look at what those employees value, you know, what is important to them, it's all literally all over the board. You've got some who value family, some who value God, some who value money, some who value Aunt Edna, you name it. They're literally all over the place. Organization B, you've got a very similar, a group of people who all are holding to very similar values. I would say that probably 75% or more of the businesses in America are run like Organization A. There are a few organizations that try to not only run a business, but they also try to train their employees so that they will all share a similar value, which makes ethical dilemmas a whole lot easier. How would you go about teaching somebody, how would you go about getting, let's say you're the head of a small business, how do you get from A to B?
Hire Christians.
Did somebody say hire a Christian?
That's a good one, JJ.
Yes, I did. In Charleston.
Hey, Jay,
Yeah.
brother, I got news for you. There's been times in my life where I would almost prefer to do business with non-Christians.
So that makes that good.
It is sad. But you know who the slowest people to pay the bills are? It's Christians.
Wow.
You know who the people who want the biggest discounts are? It's Christians.
Okay, let's hire a world.
Let's hire Satan.
Dude, we got a lot to cover in an hour and a half. You guys take a short break. We'll come back.